Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. In 1831, Michael Faraday dreamed up what was thought at first to be kind of an odd device. He took a tube, wrapped it in copper wire, and then passed a magnet through it. When he measured it, he found electrical current being generated. Skeptics at the time, according to legend, asked him, "What good is it?" Not too long afterward, a variant of this device was used to power the lights in Parliament, and today it powers most of the world. It is the electric generator. The power of imagination is not just the basis for all human invention, although it is that, of course, but it's actually the basis of the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. It's the basis of our relationships, whatever careers we have, our understanding of where we live, our understanding of our place in the universe, the sacred tales, sometimes called myths, by which we live, and a number of other things. All essential to our sense of humanity. It's not an add-on capability, it's a foundation. And so one of the exercises of imagination, fantasy, which we could think of as a playful form of it, was understood by Freud to indicate what he called the primary process. That underneath our plans, no matter how rational, no matter how objective we think we're being, is a layer of fantasy, most of it unconscious, hence the word primary. What follows from it, thoughts and plans and schemas and things like that, he referred to as secondary. So let's talk a little bit about this mysterious power and different forms it can take, and a little bit about how we might develop it. And here's a heads up. I'm going to be devoting a number of free weekly videos on this topic. I'm going to start posting them on Fridays pretty soon. And there's a word that goes with them that I coined to indicate how imagination can serve as a form of knowledge. So we're going to call this Imagine Knowing. Imagining not just as entertainment, although it can be used for that, and not just for kids, but as a legitimate path of knowledge, wisdom, empathy, self-reflection, creativity, and innovation, and ecological consciousness. Something we're in much need of today. You know, it's hard to define imagination. We're so immersed in it, it's like trying to define consciousness. And it transcends our definition in part because we have to use it in order to define anything at all, including itself. So we're stuck in a sort of loop of consciousness. So we can get at it a little bit if we think about imagination, not just as the formation of internal visual images. Well, you know, what about blind people? They have imagination. So we can move a little bit past the narrow dictionary definitions, and we might start surmising that imagination is more like an internal or mental way of seeing, of visualizing, of intuiting something not present, something not measurable, not visible. When we imagine we are coming up with something, we're inventing something, at first something mental, whether we do it alone, by ourselves, or we do it in a group. So this capacity that we have for conceiving what doesn't currently sit right in front of us is a part of the wonderful, miraculous power of imagination. And sometimes fantasy is put in counterpose to imagination. And the way I tend to hold it, and will in this podcast and in my other work, is that fantasizing is a playful form of imagining. And it often starts out more personally oriented, more towards our needs and wishes as individuals, but not always. And when I talk about a fantasy, I mean a result of imagining. When I was in my early 30s, deeply unhappy as a technical writer in the corporate world, I began to fantasize that I was teaching people and doing psychotherapy. And I made the mistake of sharing some of these fantasies with less receptive coworkers who had abandoned their dreams for the false security of a permanent job. And they said, most of these were older people, they said, yeah, when we were your age, we had these kinds of fantasies too, these kinds of dreams. But eventually we had to face the fact that, a secure job is a good thing, even if you're not terribly happy with it. And sometimes it's just best to settle for things. And I couldn't hear that. The fantasies proved stronger than the advice that well-meaning coworkers gave me. So I left the corporate world, went back to school, and eventually became, for a while, a psychotherapist, and then after that, a teacher, a graduate instructor. And I have found that those positions were actually a lot more financially secure in some ways than the jobs my coworkers had, all of whom were eventually laid off, not long after I left the company. And so this points to one of the survival values of being in touch with your imagination. It allows you to anticipate things without actually having to live them out, which in some situations can be disastrous. Before I left that company, I was having nightmares about plane crashes and my coworkers all being killed. So at some level, my unconscious was already reading the writing on that wall, even though at the time I didn't have the tools to interpret the message. But I knew they meant something bad. And I knew I needed to act, which I did. I went back to school. Now, imagination itself has not received generous amounts of study or research. Some of its fruits have. So creativity, there's tons of research and books on creativity and also innovation. So let's draw a few distinctions here. And unfortunately, in this case, a field that should take imagination seriously and sometimes does, philosophy, has tended to consider it, at least in the West, in the hands of Western philosophers, as a sort of poor copy of reality, which doesn't really get us anywhere. And there's exceptions to that. But in fact, one big one was the fantasy science fiction work, The Blazing World, written by philosopher Margaret Cavendish. That novel was actually written a significant amount of time before Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which some people consider the first science fiction novel, certainly the first modern science fiction novel. But Margaret Cavendish was already at work. And in her prologue to that novel, she says that one of the reasons she's doing this is because as a woman, she is denied any sort of leadership privileges in her culture, especially political and financial ones. So she'll make up her own world, and she invites other women to do the same. And she says, if you don't like the world I've invented, then I invite you to make up your own, and you live in that one. So in some circles, this work is now considered a feminist classic. An example, one of many, of imagination and fiction making a difference in the real world. So yes, you can find all kinds of things on creativity. 10 easy steps to being creative and how to innovate your business and all that stuff. Some of it's valuable. Don't want to discount it, but we should draw some distinctions though. And here I'd like to agree with both depth psychology and also with the two authors of a useful book called Imagination First, which also has a lot of very useful exercises in it for developing your imagination. And what they maintain is that imagination is primary. Before creativity, before innovation, there's imagination. That's the basis. And I would add fantasy. So they put it like this: first imagination, and once you start using that, you become creative. So they hold creativity as a kind of applied imagination. And then if your creativity actually changes things, if it really alters the forms that it's using, then it becomes innovation. And so I would sneak in fantasy along that path as well. Right after the primary focus of imagination, I would put fantasy as one of its products. Fantasy and fantasizing. Now, I want to deal at this point with, before I say more about creativity and innovation, I want to deal with some culturally based objections that come up when we even talk about taking imagination and fantasy seriously. And those of us who are kind of natural dreamers have heard these, but we haven't always known how to respond to them. So I think I've pretty much already dealt with, through my anecdote at the beginning, the idea that imagination is just for kids. We can certainly see it in a particularly clear form in kids before they're taught not to have an imagination. Or actually, it's more accurate to say to conceal their imagination because we all have one. So there's one bias. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about the fact that imagination is basically responsible for our whole civilization. And the misuses of imagination responsible for the violence between us. Another bias, which comes more from the religious side of the house, is that imagination is dangerous and has to be controlled. It seems to be most dangerous when it's identified with, which tends to happen when we're not aware of it as imagination. So when people kill each other over their religious beliefs, they are taking images, creeds, and symbols that are not reducible to imagination, but were given form by the imagination. They're taking them as factual and then arguing over them. And I would think that if we had a clearer sense of when the imagination operates, we'd actually live in a much more peaceful world. We wouldn't be fighting each other over literalized fantasies. Whose is best? Whose is biggest, right? Another bias that comes up is imagination can't be taught. Well, it doesn't need to be because we all have it. And what needs to happen and what can be taught is how to develop it and how to listen to it better. That can certainly be taught. I've taught that for years. And then a last objection to fantasy that I'll mention here is that it's impractical. All practical projects begin in fantasy. And, for those who like money as a bottom line, look up how much Disney, Star Wars projects, and Paramount Star Trek projects, Harry Potter, and all those, all based in fantasy. Take a look at the revenue streams there and ask yourself that question again. In fact, it might easily be argued that the public is so distractible by fantasy, whether it's quality fantasy or whether it's mindless trash, because we're hungry for fantasy altogether. We've been told that we shouldn't indulge in it, and so it's like a guilty pleasure. We do live in a time where there's some recognition of that, and in a lot of corporations these days, there's emphasis on innovation. I've been given cash awards for innovative ideas when I was still in the corporate world. So on the one hand, there's a push for it, but on the other hand, when it actually happens, it's often denounced as too radical. And yes, not every imaginative idea is a good idea or can be implemented. But one thing that imagination teaches us is that when we have an immediate fear reaction to innovation, that too is a product of imagination, an unconscious one. And it's one that we need to look at and be aware of. Otherwise, we will underestimate the power of imagination to make real change. When I was still working as a tech writer in the corporate world, HR hired some consultants to come in and teach us about communication. And so a bunch of us were divided up into pairs, and the communication experts placed visual barriers between each member of the pair. So I'm at a table with somebody else, and I can't see what's in front of them. I can't see them. Same with the other pairs in the room. And then one person was given puzzle pieces, which in this case was me. I was the partner with those. And then the other person was given instructions, and they would read them out loud to guide the person on the other side of the barrier in making the puzzle. Now, what the consultants didn't tell us, and this was deliberate, is that the puzzle piece shapes didn't match the instructions. So your partner might say, put the red circle in the circle shape box. And then you look down and you don't have a red circle, you have a blue circle and you have a red square, something like that, right? So the point was supposed to be that when communication gets garbled, then you can't work together. You can't make things happen. And it's a valid point. That happens all the time, every day. Um, in my case, though, I've tended since childhood to um, not necessarily think outside the box, um, but to think differently inside one. So, and I've given myself permission to do that. I think because I like fantasy and speculative fiction and science fiction so much, um, myths, all of that. So at the end of the exercise, there was confusion and my pieces aren't going together and all that. And then the consultant said, "Okay, we're going to come clean. Here's what happened," and that's why no one could solve the puzzle. And I raised my hand and I said, "We solved it." And they said, "That's impossible." And I said, "Well, come and see." So they came over and looked, and all our puzzle pieces were in the boxes. And they said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "Well, I realized that the instructions were intended to confuse us, so I folded all the pieces so they would fit in the boxes." And they said, "That's cheating." And I said, "It's not cheating. You didn't tell us we couldn't fold the pieces." And at first, they didn't like that solution. Not at all. But then as the day went on, they warmed to it a bit. And then they finally said, "Yeah, that's good innovation. So what I want to stress here is that I didn't do that because I had a better imagination than anybody or more imagination or anything like that. I did it because I gave myself permission to use my imagination. That was the only difference between me and anybody else in the room. When you're able to abandon the assumptions that other people are using, not as an act of defiance or revolt, but just as an act of mental suspension. What if we didn't think of it this way? That can open the door to allowing imagination and fantasy to flow. It unchains the imagination. One of those cash awards I mentioned was for inventing something called a snapshot amendment. And all it amounted to is we were at a time when people had been laid off and our workload had doubled without double the pay. And we were threatened with layoff, my whole team that was writing contracts. And we kept doing it the old-fashioned way. We were replacing entire sections of contracts whenever we amended them for our clients. And so I questioned that. I didn't say it was wrong. I didn't rage about it. I just asked myself, what would happen if we only replaced the text that got changed? And is there a legal precedent for that? So I ran it by the legal people, and they were good with it. And then I proposed it. And probably saved my job. Because then we did everything twice as fast and we got ahead of our workload. Although you have to be careful when you do that sometimes, because then you might get even more work. So my two examples, very small examples of possible innovations by using imagination. Imagine big ones. Imagine an economy where other people don't control the resources that you need to live on. What would that be like? Imagine an enforced international law where the leaders of two countries about to go to war with each other would be forced to spend a month together, isolated from the rest of the world, getting to know each other as human beings. You think there'd be any wars after that? Imagine Terrania, a world of justice and equity and abundance and safety and delight. You say it's impossible? I say, well, we can get a good start on it by imagining it together, because that's the first step in actually creating it. Thank you.